All right. Good afternoon, Professor Emeagwali. Could you please introduce yourself to the audience?
Okay, well, I'm Gloria Emeagwali. I've been a professor for the last 25, 30 years, I guess. I've taught at several universities. Ahmadu Bello University would remain my, my best university. I enjoyed teaching there, and then I went to the University of Ilorin in Kwara State. Whilst I was in Kwara State in the University of Ilorin, I was also teaching at the Nigerian Academy of Science. The Nigerian Defense Academy
Okay.
in Kaduna. So I like to mention this because people think I used to go by plane,
Mm.
you know, because I taught once a week, and so I will pick up my flight, get to Kaduna, and fly back to Ilorin, you know. And we had a very good, the airport was quite reliable and air flights quite in order, etc. Anyway, so yes, I've also done research on Nigerian history, and my interest started with pre-colonial Nigeria, and then broadened into indigenous knowledge systems. Also, structural adjustment programs as they affected the society. I know you've also done some
Yes,
work on
I've
that.
done some work on that.
Yes. So I have covered a range. But, in American universities, at least the university that I am at, you teach several courses. And that got me interested in looking at South African history. For example, I have a course on South African history, the apartheid and post-apartheid South Africa, and so on, and other areas. I have to tell you, I've also been interested in ancient Northeast Africa. I remember somebody saying, but that's quite a lot of areas. I said, well, I've been at it for quite a long while. And you don't just stay in one area.
It's good to be intellectually curious.
So I guess to answer your question, I've done several areas of research, and at the moment I am based in Connecticut. As a matter of fact, for the last 20 years, I didn't realize it was so long. And I'm in the Department of History there.
So, this sounds very interesting, and there's so many tangents I'd like to go on, but I'm going to stick to the subject that I want to inquire into with you. I'd like to talk to you about Professor Wangari Maathai. And one of the things I'd like to know from you is what is your recollection? How do you think of her when you think of her?
I think I'm a bit biased. As a historian, I look at Wangari Maathai probably in a slightly different perspective from a political scientist. I don't know. But I really see her as having a very tremendous legacy for history and for the historian. Tremendous legacy for the historian, for history. Wangari Maathai was a historian in her own right. I know some people would say, oh, I thought she was in the biological sciences, etc. She was a historian looking at pre-colonial Kenya, colonial Kenya, and also the post-colonial or neo-colonial Kenya, giving us a lot of insights into what the pre-colonial society, in terms of environmental values, in terms of diet. For example, I remember her making a point in Unbowed that the pre-colonial diet was free from fat, free from salt,
From
and free from
preservatives.
sugar. And therefore, obesity, diabetes, and those kinds of problems were not a major issue. That it was a vegetarian diet. And some would, at first I was a bit surprised, but she suggests that you're dealing with the abundant use of vegetables of different types. And then she also goes on to identify the local naming process and the geographical knowledge, intellectual knowledge of the community in terms of identifying these different botanical species, flora and fauna, physical geography. She talks about indigenous naming processes for Mount Kenya, for the river systems, etc. And that really, was fascinating. In terms of the colonial period, and again, I'm talking about her as a historian. I have about two other categories that I would like to refer to also. In other words, Wangari Maathai as a maker of history, and also Wangari Maathai as somebody who encouraged and sponsored, to a large extent, if you want, an advocate for history. But anyway, as a historian, in terms of the colonial period, we have a lot of information corroborated, and I would say that we knew that the British, interned about 1 million people from other sources and so on. But having it from an eyewitness report, sort of, somebody who lived during the period, at least part of that period, is always good for a historian. We like to get as many sources as possible. She talks about the war veterans and the fact that the war veterans did not get land, whilst the white war veterans got land, Kenyan land. The black war veterans got none. And, so these kinds of injustices during the colonial era would be highlighted by Wangari Maathai. And although, as a historian, you would have had information about this, but it's definitely an additional source of information from if not an eyewitness, somebody who lived during the period, at least part of that colonial period. I found her discussion about the missionaries and Christianity also very illuminating. And so as a historian, she would shed light on certain aspects of Christianity, which sometimes, are not, are pushed under the carpet. Now, definitely she would recognize and acknowledge certain contributions, but I think her big point was that alienation would be one of the major contributions. The missionaries, the Christian-oriented churches, schools would actually try as much as possible to remove as much of the African identity as possible. De-Africanization process, would be undertaken by them, and she was not happy about this, and who would be? And she would give so we have insights into colonial Kenya that would be very useful for history and for the historian. And then again, in terms, a lot more, but in terms of the post-colonial, here you have pro-democracy activists running into big trouble with a dictatorial government, by the way, which was sponsored by the United States. And some people sort of forget that Moi was a creation of the United States. He was consolidated by the United States during the Cold War era, and this woman had to fight him. It's just an irony that, of course, on the other hand, she was given a scholarship by the Kennedy administration and benefited also from the largesse of the United States. But at the same time, ironically, she would also have to fight with one of the monsters created by this, or at least, if not created, but supported by this particular regime. So the post-colonial regime and the trauma that is associated with this process of getting rid of colonization, decolonization, I think would be very much discussed by her directly and indirectly. And the decolonization process would be a painful process. In fact, I think she would argue that, you know, the process, even by the time she was, by the time she passed away, you know, that process had not been completed. So you have Wangari Maathai, the historian. But then again, you have Wangari Maathai, the maker of history.
All right. In what ways
You know,
did she? I mean, what are the most significant ways in which she made history?
well, first of all, besides creating one of the most formidable social movements in the world, I think we have to say not just in Kenya or Africa, but in the world, the Green Belt movement. I mean, who has been associated with replanting about 60 million trees? You know, so she's a maker of history in terms of her pioneering activities, innovation. She broke the glass ceiling, so to speak, in terms of those restraints for women, and painfully, a maker of history in the sense that, you know, she was in a very long battle. It wasn't an overnight affair. This is a pioneer who worked at it, who, you know, had to struggle through thick and thin, so to speak, to achieve what she eventually achieved. She made history too in terms of, you know, that batch of students being sent here to the United States. She was the first group, I believe, to be associated with the JFK's program. I also must add that when she decided to defy President Moy, that in itself, and carried on with her persisted in the defiance, I think that was, I would rank her in the same category as the Burmese dissident who was able to, after struggling for a long period, to challenge the Burmese government. She is definitely in that category too. Confronting the Moy regime, you know, the beatings, the imprisonment, the harassment, her trees being pulled out.
She lost her job.
You know, her job was lost and so on. So I think in terms of defiance of the status quo and defiance of dictatorship and defiance of human rights abuses, she would be definitely remembered and a maker of history in that sense. I have to say also that in terms of university teaching and the disparity in wages between male and female faculty, we note that although she wasn't extremely active at that moment in fighting against that, but she definitely let her voice be heard. So she's a maker of history in terms of all these different perspectives. And again, because of her multidimensional capabilities, we've got to remember that, multidimensional capabilities, um, she was able to write history and at the same time do biology and do environmental work. The third area I want to stress in terms of her contributions would be her advocacy for history. She has written several works. You have the Greenbelt Movement, you have Unbowed, the third, Challenged for Africa, and the other text, Replenishing the Earth. And in all of these works, we have a sense of accomplishment. We have a sense also of a very deep concern for writing about preserving the historical tradition. But she actually would be very direct about it. There are very many quotations in her work, especially the last two works, talking about the need to recollect, the need for Africa to remember. As a matter of fact, there's one quotation where she says that, Africans must just get rid of that habit of trying to forget. Instead, they have to remember. Remember the past. Remember cultural traditions and whatever might be positive about the various traditions. And some of her quotes about this idea of memory, historical memory, would be very much to the point. We've got to remember, for example, environmental traditions. And as a matter of fact, she would talk about the extent to which cutting down a tree in the pre-colonial period was not done just simply like that. You had to replace that tree, or you had to know that you were doing something that was not ordinary. And in Unbowed, she talks about the fig tree. And that fig tree would be associated with access to water. It was cherished by the community, as a matter of fact. And so she would be telling us, remember your history, remember what the ancestors, the grandparents, etc. did, and identify those aspects of that are positive, and continue that tradition. So I think a lot of a discussion, and in a sense you may say that this would be a backup to her role as an environmentalist. She spent a lot of time talking about what the pre-colonial African tradition was in terms of the environment. That the environment was not something to degrade, but something to cherish. And that, of course, brought her to discussions about religion and spirituality. And so I remember a very clear statement by her which says that the sacred groves must become sacred again. Sacred groves must become sacred again. And in the course of the discussion surrounding this, she would point to the benefits, the positive benefits of indigenous religious tradition or spirituality in general. And I thought that, of course, she would remind the reader that these traditions, whether it's in terms of environmental, avoiding erosion, avoiding environmental degradation or whatever, these traditions must be maintained, and the historical memory, therefore, is important. So there you have the woman as a historian recollecting and putting in place, uh, reconstructing and talking about the history of the region. And also, I must say, highlighting certain aspects of historical discourse which actually have been ignored. You know, the environmental history, for example, or traditional religious and traditional scientific knowledge, especially traditional scientific knowledge, would be something that you would identify in terms of looking at what was done and identifying what was scientific about it. You know, that is, it wasn't just a matter of blind practice without positive logic. And so that kind of systematic analysis would also be very helpful. So I actually, again, as I said, I have some bias here as a historian, but I see her as really contributing a great deal to history.
So if you were to focus on one single thing or one singular contribution that she made, what would it be?
Well, again, it's hard to, you cannot forget the phenomenal contribution to preserving the environment, or at least to arresting the spread of the desert, preventing erosion, and also conflict in the process, preventing conflict, and so on. But her work on the pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial era, for me, is phenomenal.
So also as a as an historian yourself, what kind of inspiration do you draw from her work that directly impacts on what you do?
Oh, as a matter of fact, I've been very interested. I've done, a website, and I've done a lot of work on indigenous knowledge systems. So you could see why I would be so fascinated to see her interest in that field too. And so as a historian, it certainly gives me great pride in seeing another scholar, a scholar of her caliber, interested in the kind of indigenous scientific knowledge systems that I also have paid attention to.
All right. Well, I think we've learned a lot, and I do thank you. I think finally, suppose there's a student and the student came to you and said, I've heard about Wangari Maathai. What can I do to honor her memory? What would you tell the student?
Well, first of all, I think we really have to pay attention to her original works. As I actually told this to a student, Kenyan student, graduate student. I said, "Have you read her works?" He said, "Not really." But he read about her.
Mm-hmm.
I said, "No, go read her works. You've got to read the 4 books of Wangari Maathai to really, you can get, third-party, interpretations and so on.